Hey, this is Juan Paredes. I'm running for Congress in Florida's 26th Congressional District, and this is my Democracy Gauntlet. So, first, I want to talk about digital democracy. In my opinion, I actually think it would be detrimental to make democracy more digital. I work in the tech industry, and technology is not advanced enough to be foolproof. There is going to be infiltrators that are going to want to infiltrate digital democracy infrastructure. And if you look at banks, for example, banks aren't perfect. There's many times where a bank is compromised, but if a bank is compromised, it's insured, there's fail safes, and it can easily be reversed. But if you're talking about democracy, you can't really reverse an election so easily. So having those fail safes have a much higher standard of security. And for you to make democracy digitally and secure at the same time would be extremely onerous. In fact, it would probably limit the amount of access people have to democracy because you need very strict two-factor authentication measures. You would need very strict verification systems and very sensitive lockout procedures. It's going to be actually more difficult to have a more accessible democracy and make it secure at the same time if it's digital. I would actually prefer we expand democracy by making it more accessible and having just our regular paper ballots that we have now. So making it, for example, instead of having Tuesdays for elections, move it to something more convenient for most people, like a weekend, and make that weekend a national holiday. That way people have paid time off to go and vote, and they don't have to worry about their work or getting time off or being paid. We can make democracy a lot more accessible for everybody, and still keep our paper ballots because nothing is more secure than paper. Paper has a trail, and you can't infiltrate it wirelessly, and it's a lot more difficult to tamper with. So I would actually, in my opinion, prefer to have a more accessible democracy, but not by making it digital and making it more vulnerable. So now if you want to talk about voting rights, we want to make our democracy as accessible as possible. People are actually using voter ID laws to trump up fears about infiltration in our democracy that doesn't exist. And I'm not saying like there's never any kind of people trying to vote twice or people trying to subvert our democracy in any way. It exists, but it's not prevalent enough to have any kind of restrictions on people's voting through voter ID. So and there's also the elections take place at a very inconvenient time, very early time frames on Tuesdays where people have to work. This is all to limit the amount of people that can vote, and by making voter turnout very low. So I think that we should have our democracy be very accessible to everybody. If you have voter ID, make it instantaneously distributed to everybody free of charge. That way that nobody has to be worrying about standing in lines to get an ID or paying money to get an ID. If we want to have our democracy more accessible, we have to make it a national holiday where people get paid, mandated by the government for that day, and they also have a day off, and make it during a more convenient time, make the time frames much larger, and to have it during a weekend, and vastly increase the number of ballot boxes within the country, which are systematically being reduced to make it difficult for certain communities to vote. And now I want to discuss ranked choice voting. I am very much in favor of ranked choice voting. There are many systems you can use in ranked choice voting, but my particular favorite is single transfer vote, where we don't actually have to change much of our distribution of our districts and how we vote for the most part today. We just have to, for example, the way single transfer vote works is we combine three districts into one. We make the amount of points equal to the amount of winners. That would be three winners. So it'd be three districts is one, and we'll have three winners in that district. So that means that there will be three winners in that new one district, and then we divide the number of total votes by the number of people running to get elected. So that means that everybody to win that election, to be a winning candidate in that election, you need 33% of the vote rather than just the majority, which is 50% plus one. And and you'd have and then you rank each person by how much you want them to win from 1 to 3. And the single transfer vote would make it so if people exceed 33% of the vote, their number, the amount of votes that exceeds 33%, gets moved to your second choice. And the excess from the second choice gets moved to the third choice. And people who don't make the 33% of the vote, they would remove the smallest number and move that to your second choice. And then if they don't exceed, then move that to your third choice. That way, that way we ensure that every single person's vote matters. So if we ignore the excess, then we're not really being representative of the district. And if we make it majority rule, we're still not being representative. And also, this makes it basically impossible to gerrymander, because if you gerrymander the district in the excess, we will still move the votes to your second favorite choice. So it doesn't matter how many more a candidate wins. So it actually makes it impossible to gerrymander mathematically, and it makes it a lot more representative for the district that the people are voting in. Now let's talk about freedom of the press and whistleblowers in particular. The country that we're in uses the Espionage Act to act against whistleblowers who actually are doing the country a service rather than a disservice. The Espionage Act, for example, was used against Edward Snowden after he exposed the links. I mean, people understood that the country was monitoring their citizens unwantedly, but he actually exposed to what lengths and what levels they were doing it, completely unconstitutional, and actually demonstrated that people who were testifying in Congress previously from Homeland Security were actually lying to Congress previously in their previous testimonies. So it was a large service he did to the country, because he actually cares for the country. He wants the country to be better. And then instead of rewarding him and treating him favorably, we use the Espionage Act because people in power have an interest in ensuring that these things are kept secret, that they can monitor you without you knowing, they can have all the information they want, and they can ensure that their power is protected. So I fully support it not so much ending the Espionage Act, but regulating its use heavily. That way, we can't use it against citizens of our country that are actually whistleblowing against our nation. And we have to also have measures in place to protect whistleblowers. We have to have specific protections that allow them to give information to the media without fear of blowback, because having that fear disincentivizes others who want to do the right thing from doing it, because they fear the antagonism and the hostility they'll get from their own state department. So it's vital for whistleblowers to have these protections, and it's also vital for the press to have the freedom to report on these disinformation given to them by whistleblowers. So now to discuss public financing or election reform for financing of elections. When we're looking at publicly funding elections, there's actually about 14 states that do it. Most of them do a clean election public financing, which is basically they ask you to. Actually, no, I'm sorry. They do matching. Most of them do matching, which they will match the amount of money you raise from contributions. Clean election public financing is when they have you raise a certain amount of money first to validate your competitiveness and make sure that you're a serious candidate. And then once you raise a certain amount of money, depending on the seat that you're running for, they will provide you with a certain amount of months depending on that seat. So these are the two used in our country so far on certain states for state positions. There's no federal positions that have public finance elections. And I'm actually more in favor of a voucher system that gives citizens a certain amount of money to use for an election only through a voucher, and they can choose which candidate they want to spend that voucher on. And it actually makes it a lot more fair for grassroots candidates to have a chance of winning elections. The way, I mean, people want to remove Citizens United because Citizens United is seen as the death of our democracy, but our democracy died a long time ago, way before Citizens United was a thing. Citizens United is actually fairly inconsequential if you look at the impacts of it after it was passed. It's actually a lot more expensive for companies to directly get involved in elections. If you look at Target, for example, when they were trying to influence the country against the freedoms for gay marriage, they actually had protests nationwide all over their stores because of it, and they failed spectacularly in having any kind of meaningful impact. This is because Citizens United allows corporations to invest in campaigns independently, meaning that they can't directly fund the campaign, but they can have ads or any kind of other types of investment that aren't directly funding the campaign. It still has a face and a name behind it. You know who's doing it. You know where the money's coming from. What's actually really detrimental, but not solely detrimental, but particularly is super PACs, which are not constitutional. You can argue that from the First Amendment that corporations should have an ability to invest money in an election as they see fit, as long as they're not investing directly to the campaign. But there's no constitutional argument for super PACs. Super PACs are a separate organization with unknown contributors for money which is undisclosed sources. It's basically dark money that can freely fund any kind of campaign and any kind of campaign ads the same way a company could through Citizens United, and that itself isn't constitutional. The company individually has a constitutional argument, but super PACs do not have a constitutional argument. And I would abolish super PACs entirely, as they just breed dark money and corruption within our system. But also, what makes campaigns or elections really difficult in terms of funding is not just that by itself, but also the amount of money necessary that you need to win. So that's why public funding would actually make our democracy a lot more robust, because our institutions purposely require you to have a lot of money, expensive ads for TVs, expensive field operations. There's information gatekeepers, which actually influence is waning because of the internet, like the national media, which have an interest in making sure that certain information passes because they are multi-million-dollar corporations whose customers are multi-billion-dollar corporations. So they have their own invested interests. All these things are detrimental to our elections and should be part of any type of election reform. But the backbone of it should be a public finance system, particularly, in my opinion, through vouchers. And lastly, I want to speak about the Electoral College. I'm actually in favor of abolishing the Electoral College because it actually it doesn't serve the purpose that people say it serves, and the only purpose it serves is to make certain states more important than others. So, like, let's look at the last election, for example. The Electoral College assigns 530 electoral votes in total. So that means if every single vote was proportional, we'd have every 570,000 people have one electoral vote. But the rules of the Electoral College mandates that every single state gets 3 electoral votes before the numbers are distributed. So that means that certain states' votes mean less than others, because some states some states get 3 or 4 electoral votes because of that rule, when they should only be getting 1 or 2. So if you live in Iowa, for example, that's 1 Iowa vote is equal to 4 Texas votes. And if you look at New Hampshire, one New Hampshire vote is equal to three California votes. So that is it's very detrimental, and it doesn't protect minority states like people say. If you look at the last election in 2020, the states that got the most visits were North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Ohio. And those aren't the smallest states in the union, and some of them are very large states, and maybe not in size, but particularly in population. So it doesn't protect small states like they say, and a lot of small states are completely ignored anyway. What it does is because they only have to have majority to win the entire electoral votes, meaning that they only have to get one more vote more than their opponent. So they just need 50% plus one votes. They don't really have to go into states that they know they're going to win. So Republican states are ignored by Republicans and Democratic states are ignored by Democrats and Republicans because they know exactly how they're going to vote. So there's a lot of states that are completely rejected outright, and then and then states that are small that don't have extra votes like Iowa or New Hampshire get ignored entirely as well because their votes are too proportional. So it actually doesn't do anything what people say it does. It just makes it easier for candidates to subvert a lot of the population by visiting places like Wyoming, New Hampshire, um, uh, Iowa, places where their vote matters the most, and places like Florida where it's very contentious, whereas there's no winner or loser there. These states are the only ones that get the most attention with the electoral college. So it's actually not beneficial to anyone. It's actually more beneficial to have everybody vote directly for the president, and it wouldn't make presidents only care about the large cities, because even if you get all 10 of the largest cities and combine their population, that's only about 8% of the United States population. The largest city is New York with 8 million people. And then once you reach city number 5, you're looking at less than a million people. So it's not, so these cities will have some influence, but not a large influence. The most important thing is being able to have everybody's vote count. And that's what we want in a democracy. Otherwise, we can hardly call ourselves a democracy if that's the case. And history shows that it's very possible for candidates to win without having the popular vote, which is antithetical to a democracy. So I'm very much in favor of abolishing the Electoral College.